Just a few days ago, life felt like its usual whirlwind, packed with work deadlines and the never-ending demands of family life. My wife, Emily, and I had our share of ups and downs, but nothing seemed too overwhelming. We had built a life together, filled with laughter and memories, though lately, I couldn't shake a gnawing sense of unease. I tried to brush it off as just the stress of the daily grind, but the tension between Emily and me was growing. Our minor disagreements were escalating into bigger fights. She had become distant, almost erratic, and whenever I tried to bring it up, she would shrug it off as if it were nothing. Deep down, I knew something was wrong, but I never imagined how bad it would get. Now, here I am, sitting on the cold hardwood floor of our bedroom, utterly exhausted and overwhelmed. I could hardly believe the situation I found myself in. Just a few days ago, I couldn't have imagined that my life would unravel so quickly. The rug, once a symbol of our cozy home, was now a stained, ruined mess, a stark reminder of how everything had gone so horribly wrong. I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, "What the hell am I doing? I'm better than this." When I opened them, I saw our wooden bed frame, and for a brief moment, I pictured Emily standing beside it. But I knew that vision was just a ghost of the past. Nothing was going to be the same again. Everything was spiraling out of control. My hands were trembling as I tried to steady myself, overwhelmed by the chaos around me. The room seemed to blur, but my eyes locked onto a half-empty bottle of whiskey and an open bottle of pills lying on the bed. I didn't even cap the bottle. I thought bitterly as the pungent smell of alcohol filled the air. Panic started to set in as I looked around for the letters I had written. They were still on the nightstand, not on the bed, thankfully safe from the mess. But a new fear gripped me. What if the wrong person found them? I quickly dismissed the thought, realizing I wouldn't be around to worry about it. Why did it have to come to this? I asked myself, feeling a wave of nausea rise in my throat. My daughter would hate me for this, but after what happened last week, she probably already did. "I can't take this pain anymore," I whispered, even as my life was slipping away. The pain in my wrists dulled slightly, and a strange sense of calm began to wash over me. I expected something, maybe a flash of my life, a bright light, or even just darkness. But there was nothing, only the stark realization that I wanted to live, but it was too late. As the darkness closed in, I felt my last bit of strength drain away. A week ago, I was laughing with my daughter, Sarah, spinning her around in our home in Portland, Maine. She's 20, and her boyfriend, Mike, had just proposed. "Dad, he proposed," she had said, her eyes sparkling with joy. I had seen it coming and had already given my blessing. Sarah and Mike had been inseparable since high school, and I couldn't have been happier for her. Sarah was practically glowing as she recounted how Mike had sent her on a treasure hunt around the city, finally proposing under the old oak tree in Deering Oaks Park. "His joy was infectious," she said, her excitement contagious as she told Emily and me about the proposal. I hugged her tight, twirling her around, thrilled for them both. The next morning, in the kitchen, I reassured her that even though they were young, their love was solid. I admired the engagement ring on her hand, smiling. "It's beautiful, Sarah," I said, then turned to Mike. "You did a great job picking it out." Emily, sitting nearby with a glass of wine, smirked. Even at 44, she was still stunning. Her brown hair falling gracefully around her tanned face, her brown eyes sharp and observant. "You should thank me," she said, raising her glass. "I helped Mike choose it." "Mom, that's not appropriate," Sarah said, looking uncomfortable. "It's okay, sweetie," Emily replied with a dismissive wave. "I know you made the final choice." The comment didn't sit right with me. Emily had been acting strangely for months, small comments and actions that didn't seem like the loving woman I thought I knew. We continued the celebration with a nice dinner, but the unease from Emily's comment lingered. The next morning, Emily and I woke up slowly, and just as things started to get intimate, she suddenly pulled away and walked off to the bathroom, leaving me bewildered. "Emily," I called after her. "What's wrong?" From the bathroom, she replied coldly, "I need some space." A minute later, she added, "I'm already getting cleaned up." Stunned, I finished showering and found a note in the kitchen saying she was leaving for the day. Anger boiled within me. In all our years together, Emily had never been so dismissive. The thought hit me hard. Was she cheating on me? I was lost in thought when my friend James called. "Hey, Tom, what's going on?" he asked, his usual upbeat tone coming through the phone. "Not much." I lied, trying to hide my frustration. "Something's wrong. I can tell," James said, sensing my mood. I spent the next 10 minutes venting about Emily's strange behavior. James chuckled. "If she's cheating, there's not much you can do. Divorce is a 50-50 split, and if she's not working, she'll clean you out." "That's not helping," I snapped, irritated. "I'm just being realistic," James replied. "Let's talk tomorrow at work. We've got that report due on the Cedarbrook project, and we can catch up after." "Yes, sure." I agreed, but without much enthusiasm. James and I worked together. I was the senior architect, and he was the project manager. We were a good team, balancing each other out. Somehow, I got through Sunday. Emily came home late, nearly midnight, and didn't say a word, even though she knew I was awake. The next morning, she tried to act as if nothing had happened. "This isn't going to work, Emily," I said, getting out of bed. "What do you mean?" she asked, genuinely surprised. "I started getting dressed for work. After how you treated me this weekend, I can't do this. If you're cheating on me," I trailed off, not knowing how to finish. She sneered. "And what are you going to do, Thomas? There's nothing you can do." Her tone softened slightly, but still carried a mocking edge. "Come on, just go back to bed. We both need this." I shook my head in disbelief. "Who are you? You can't treat me like this, Emily," I said, my voice trembling with anger. The contempt she was showing was beyond anything I could have imagined. "Well, screw you," she snapped back, her voice dripping with venom. Disgusted, I left the room, feeling a new and bitter loathing for my wife of 21 years. That morning at the office, I was visibly shaken. My assistant Rachel noticed right away. "Tom, are you okay? You seem off," she asked, concern etched on her face. Rachel had been my assistant for a decade. When she first joined, she had just escaped an abusive relationship, showing up for the interview with a visible black eye. Despite that, she was more than qualified, smart, capable, and much more than just a pretty face. Over the years, I'd grown to respect her deeply for her strong moral compass and her ability to handle herself in tough situations. I hesitated, but eventually confided in Rachel about what had been happening with Emily. As I spoke, her frown deepened, and by the time I finished, she was clearly angry on my behalf. "I don't know what to do, Rachel. If she's been cheating on me, I never saw it coming," I admitted, feeling utterly defeated. Rachel, who rarely touched me, placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Let's get through this Cedarbrook meeting first. There are some issues with the foundations and electrical wiring," she said, shifting focus to work. "What? Why didn't James mention this?" I asked, already running through how to handle the situation. Before we could discuss it further, James popped into my office. "You ready, buddy?" he asked, smiling as if nothing was wrong. "James, what's this about problems with the foundation and wiring?" I asked quietly. He waved it off casually. "Don't worry, we'll sort it out." But the meeting turned out to be a complete disaster. The Cedarbrook developers, usually so easygoing, were visibly upset. As I gave my progress report, their expressions grew more severe. Peter, the CEO, leaned forward and asked, "What about the cost overruns on the foundation and wiring in the northeast sector?" I looked to James, who just shrugged, offering no help. With everyone staring at me, I said, "I'll need to check the figures." Last week's reports showed everything was on budget. Peter's frown deepened. "Then why have I signed off on over $200,000 in extra costs for concrete and wiring over the last 3 months?" I was stunned. I looked to James again, but his face was unreadable. He suggested we step outside to sort things out. In another room, we met with our boss, Leonard. Before I could explain, James handed Leonard a folder. "They're asking about the missing materials as we expected," James said. Leonard turned to me, his eyes blazing with anger. "What are you saying, Thomas?" he nearly hissed. I was shocked by his tone. "Sir, I've been informed everything was on track. I didn't approve any extra costs," I tried to explain. Leonard opened the folder and glared at me. "So this is the story you're sticking to?" he asked sharply. I was confused and starting to panic. James, now looking dead serious, said, "We have requisitions for $26,000. The payments went to a bank account in your name. After all these years, this is how you repay us." Leonard's voice was rising, and I felt the situation spiraling out of control. The meeting ended with Leonard and James taking turns accusing me of fraud, refusing to believe my innocence. They called in HR, and I was fired on the spot, with Leonard threatening to involve the police. To make matters worse, Rachel was also fired because of her close association with me. As I was escorted out with just a few belongings, I caught James smirking, thinking I wouldn't notice. Outside, I found Rachel by her car, crying and in shock. "Rachel, are you okay?" I asked, but she spun around, furious. "You bastard, Thomas. You committed $200,000 in fraud and destroyed my career. I trusted you," she shouted. "It wasn't me, Rachel." I tried to explain, but she cut me off. "I saw the signed papers with your signature. How could you? And that story about Emily cheating, was that a lie too? You've ruined my life." For the first time in all the years we'd worked together, I saw pure, unbridled rage in Rachel's eyes. She slapped me hard across the face, calling me a liar and a thief before driving off. Stunned, I drove home, where Emily was waiting. She sneered as I walked in. "The cheating husband returns, pathetic," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. In the days that followed, I noticed that Emily seemed almost pleased with how everything was falling apart. Confused, I finally confronted her. "What's going on, Emily?" "I didn't do any of this," I said, desperate for some explanation. Emily grinned wickedly. "It doesn't matter, Tom. I'm done with you." A little later, there was a knock at the door. A man handed me a thick envelope. "You've been served," he said before walking away. I opened it to find divorce papers. "A divorce?" I whispered, feeling my world collapse even further. Emily laughed, a cold, heartless sound. "Of course. I've been seeing someone else for months. He's everything you're not. Interesting and with money. You've lost your job, your family, and soon, your freedom." She leaned in closer, relishing my misery. "Make it easy on yourself. Sign the papers. I'm taking the house and most of the property. You'll be in jail soon anyway, so why fight it?" "So, you're staying with your lover?" I asked, feeling utterly betrayed. She laughed again. "Yes, and once you're locked up, we'll be renting out the place. Don't even think about stalking me, or I'll have you arrested." I sat down, overwhelmed by everything. Emily noticed the red handprint Rachel had left on my face and smiled cruelly. "At least that little tramp got fired too. Go die in a hole, Thomas." And with that, she walked out. I spent the rest of the day doing nothing, not even drinking. The next day, still lost and unsure of what to do, I tried calling Sarah, but it went to voicemail. After what felt like an eternity, she finally answered. "What do you want?" she asked coldly. "Sarah, I started, but she cut me off immediately, her tone icy. "Don't even try, Dad," she snapped, her words slicing through me. "Mom told me everything, about your lies, your affair with that assistant, and how you've destroyed everything. I've never been more ashamed of anyone." Her voice was like a hammer, each word driving me deeper into despair. I tried to respond, to explain, but she interrupted again. "Listen, Mike, and I want nothing to do with you. You were on the news, for crying out loud. The police are after you. Don't show up at my wedding. I don't want a man like you anywhere near me, let alone walking me down the aisle. I'll find someone else." The words stung, leaving me speechless as tears welled up in my eyes. "Are you even listening? Do you have any idea how badly you've ruined everything?" Sarah demanded, but I could only choke on my own sobs. "Goodbye, Dad. As far as I'm concerned, you're dead to me. Don't ever try to contact me again," she said, her voice full of finality before she hung up. I crumpled to the floor, my body shaking with grief. 2 days later, the police showed up at my door, arresting me on charges of fraud. They peppered me with questions, but I had no answers to give. After hours of interrogation, they released me, but only on the condition that I remain in town until my court date the following week. Returning to what was once my home, I wandered through the empty rooms, staring at the photos and mementos that now felt like cruel reminders of a life I no longer had. My entire world had unraveled in just a few days, and I couldn't figure out how or why. My wife had left me, my daughter had disowned me, I'd lost my job, and even Rachel, who had once been my rock, now believed I was guilty. I had no one left to turn to, and the isolation was suffocating. As an engineer, I'd always prided myself on being able to solve problems, but this was beyond anything I'd ever faced. I tried to distract myself, forcing down a sandwich that tasted like sawdust, but the heaviness in my chest only grew. Losing Sarah was the hardest blow, and it felt like my heart was being crushed. I stared at the table where a bottle of sleeping pills and a nearly empty whiskey bottle sat. Dark thoughts crept in, ones I'd never entertained before, but I shook them off. I told myself I just needed time. The next morning, I received a restraining order that forbade me from contacting Emily, Mike, or James. It also demanded that I leave the house by Monday. The fact that James was included in the order struck me as odd, and suddenly, everything clicked. Overcome with rage, I grabbed my phone and sent him a furious text. "You bastard, you've ruined my life. I'll find you and make you pay for this." He didn't reply, but within hours, the detectives were back at my door, reprimanding me for violating the restraining order. They didn't care about my explanations. All they saw was a man they believed guilty. They told me to stay put and pack my things, with a detective standing watch over me, as if I were some kind of dangerous criminal. Seething, I downed 3 shots of whiskey and decided to write letters to Emily, Sarah, and Rachel. To Emily, I let out all the anger I'd been bottling up. "You betrayed me," I wrote, "and I hope you live with that guilt for the rest of your life. You're a snake, and I wish nothing but misery on you." I spit on the note before sealing it in an envelope. To Sarah, I tried to pour out my heartbreak. "I'm devastated that you never once asked if I was innocent," I wrote. "I never cheated on your mother. She's the one who betrayed me. I never stole any money." I urged her to see through the lies and to understand that things weren't as they seemed. I softened my tone as I encouraged her to cherish her love for Mike, but I begged her not to let James walk her down the aisle, as he had been a part of this betrayal. Tears soaked the paper as I sealed it. To Rachel, I began with an apology. "You're not to blame for any of this," I wrote. "I believe James has manipulated everything and is the one who's really behind all of this." I apologized if I had ever made her uncomfortable and assured her that my glances were nothing more than a shy admiration for her beauty. I asked for her forgiveness, hoping that in time she would see the truth. I placed the letters on the nightstand, attaching a note for the detectives, urging them to look into James' finances if they wanted to uncover the real truth. "Do your job properly," I wrote. "An innocent man's life has been ruined because of your negligence." I then took the whiskey and sleeping pills into the bedroom. After placing the letters where they could be easily found, I took a long, hot shower trying to wash away the despair. I sipped more whiskey, swallowed the pills, and dressed myself as if for a final act. Collapsing on the floor near the bathroom, I held a straight razor, contemplating the end. I thought about how I had gone from being a respected man to someone despised and discarded. Later, I learned that Detective David Wright had been monitoring the situation closely. A concerned neighbor had alerted him, and he entered the house just in time to save me. An ambulance was called, and my home was transformed into a crime scene. I was barely conscious when they found me, teetering on the brink of death, and I was rushed to the hospital. The investigation turned up 3 hidden cameras that I knew nothing about, along with the empty bottles and the letters. I was unconscious for 3 days. When I finally awoke, a nurse quietly informed me that I was in a private hospital in Los Angeles. She pointed out Rachel, who had stayed by my side through it all, despite everything. Seeing her there, I quietly whispered her name, and she immediately woke up, taking my hand. "Tom, what were you thinking?" she asked, her voice a mix of frustration and sadness, tears brimming in her eyes. "I thought everyone would be better off without me," I confessed, my voice breaking under the weight of my shame. She let out a bitter laugh. "You think this was the solution? I've known you for so long, and this isn't the Tom I know. What on earth were you thinking?" Rachel kept asking, her voice firm as we sat in the quiet room, the steady hum of the machines the only sound. Finally, I managed to speak, my voice weak and filled with regret. Rachel, I'm so sorry. When Emily, you, and Sarah turned against me, I felt completely cornered. No one asked if I was innocent. I was just condemned without a second thought. My wife told me to die, my daughter disowned me, my best friend betrayed me, and in the end, I hurt you too. I wasn't thinking straight. I got drunk, and in a moment of complete weakness, I did what seemed like the only way out. I shouldn't be here, I admitted, my heart heavy with shame. Rachel nodded, then gently perched on the edge of the bed. Tom, I'm sorry too, she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. I was furious, and I didn't stop to think that maybe you were innocent. I was so wrong. It's okay, Rachel, I replied softly, though the words felt hollow. No, it's not okay. The fact that you're here, and that I might have played a part in pushing you to this. I don't know how I'll ever forgive myself, she said, tears starting to flow. Really, it's okay, Rachel, I repeated, closing my eyes, feeling drained beyond belief. We sat in silence, her hand holding mine, until a doctor came in, his expression calm but serious as he reviewed my chart. Well, Mr. Davis, it's a relief to see you awake. How are you feeling, he asked. Alive, but I wasn't expecting to be, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. The doctor frowned slightly, and Rachel's grip on my hand tightened. Let's focus on keeping it that way, he said, gently dismissing my comment as he checked my wounds and vitals. Rachel winced at the sight of my injuries. The doctor explained that I needed to rest due to the severe blood loss and the effects of having my stomach pumped. He also mentioned that a detective wanted to speak with me. Once we were alone again, I asked, Rachel, did you come here because of the letter I wrote? She shook her head, her voice trembling as she replied, No, I didn't see it. Detective Wright told me what happened, she explained. My cousin works at the hospital and called me when you were brought in after. Well, after the attempt, I couldn't bring myself to look at her, the shame overwhelming me. Rachel continued, I was still so angry when I left, but deep down, I knew you couldn't have done what they said. I've worked with you for years. When I heard the news, I realized you'd been set up. I'm so sorry, Tom, she cried, her head resting against my chest, her tears soaking into my gown. After a few minutes, she pulled back and wiped her face. When she tried to pull her hand away, I held on to it. She gently wiped the tears from my eyes, managing a small smile. The more I thought about it, the less it made sense. You've always been dedicated to your work. But when James showed me those documents, I was just so furious, she said, noticing how I tensed at the mention of his name. It was him, wasn't it? James set you up. I nodded, feeling defeated. I'm almost certain, but I don't have the proof. He kept quiet about the budget issues, and there are signed documents that I've never seen before. And I suspect he's involved with Emily. I paused, the words catching in my throat. Rachel, I'm sorry you got dragged into this. I never imagined James and Emily would go this far. But I can't clear my name, and that's why I did what I did. We were quiet for a moment until a new voice interrupted our conversation. You're right, you can't prove it yet. They've done a pretty thorough job setting you up, but no real criminal would act like this. The man who walked in was tall, with an air of authority. Mr. Davis, I'm Detective David Wright. I was the one who found you, along with your neighbor, Mrs. Hawkins. It's good to see you're recovering. I shrugged, feeling numb. Thanks, but I assume you'll be arresting me once I'm discharged, I said bitterly. Rachel's hand tightened around mine. About that, Detective Wright began, glancing between us. I've been assigned to your case, and there are some inconsistencies. Would you be open to being interviewed again? I sighed. Sure, why not? I've got nothing left to lose. Rachel suddenly spoke up. Shouldn't Tom have a lawyer before you question him? The detective nodded. Yes, he should. It's a wise move. Rachel stood up. I'll handle it, she said, leaving the room to make a call. As we watched her leave, Detective Wright turned to me. She cares about you a lot, Mr. Davis. You need people in your corner right now. I'm the one under investigation, I reminded him. He smiled slightly. True, but I believe there's more to this than meets the eye. Do you believe you're innocent? Absolutely. I'd never steal from the company, and I'd never betray the trust I've built. Look, I said, showing him my bandaged wrists. Just then, Rachel returned. My cousin, Reagan Brown, will represent Tom, she announced. The detective smiled in recognition. Reagan's a solid lawyer. Have her contact me as soon as possible. We talked briefly before the detective left. That was unexpected, I remarked, still processing everything. Yeah, most cops aren't this personable, Rachel agreed. We sat quietly for a while before I asked, "Who's taking care of Tilly?" "My mom's got her," Rachel said, handing me a drawing from Tilly. It was a picture of a hospital with a big "Get well soon" message. The tears returned to my eyes. "Thank you," I whispered. "Have you heard from Sarah?" Rachel shook her head, looking sad. "I've tried reaching out, but she hasn't responded." We continued talking quietly until Reagan arrived. After brief introductions, Rachel stepped out, leaving Reagan and me alone. Like Rachel, Reagan had the same sandy brown hair and a similar warm presence. "She likes you, you know," Reagan said, echoing the detective's earlier sentiment. I snorted. "Rachel and I have worked together for years." Reagan smirked knowingly. "You men can be so oblivious." I let out a dry laugh, tinged with bitterness. "If anyone's proof of that, it's my ex-wife." Reagan gave me a sympathetic look. "Don't worry. I've spoken with Detective Wright, and it sounds like he's on your side. I've got a pretty good idea of what's going on, and I'm going to handle your case. Honestly, Tom, your only mistake was trusting the wrong people." She then asked, "What do you want out of the divorce?" My expression hardened. "I want to take everything I can from her." Reagan nodded, understanding the fury behind my words. "After what Emily and James did to you, setting you up, stealing from the company, and letting you take the blame, you've every right to go after them with all you've got. Don't hold back." I was beginning to feel a bit of hope. Reagan was sharp, and she wasn't holding anything back. She spent time going over every detail leading up to my breakdown, reassuring me that we could turn things around. She promised to arrange a formal police interview once I was released from the hospital. The next few days crawled by, with doctors and nurses checking on me regularly. I didn't have my phone, so I was cut off from everyone, not that I thought anyone would want to hear from me. But to my surprise, Rachel visited the next day, bringing me a paperback copy of The Terror by Dan Simmons. It made me chuckle, an odd but comforting choice considering the circumstances. As Rachel sat beside me, reading her Pride and Prejudice, she looked over and smiled. "I'm here to take care of you, Tom." We talked as she sat with me, and when lunchtime came around, she brought me a roast beef sandwich with chips while she had a chicken wrap. Even though my wrists still throbbed with pain, her presence helped me start to feel like myself again. Later that day, Rachel returned just as the doctors removed my four and informed me that I might be discharged the next morning if my blood tests were clear. "I don't know where to go," I admitted to her. "I don't have my phone or wallet to book a hotel, and I can't go back home." Rachel smiled reassuringly. "Reagan managed to get a court order to access your belongings. I brought your phone, wallet, clothes, laptop, iPad, and some toiletries." Her kindness floored me. "Thank you, Rachel. At least now I can find a place to stay." But I noticed a hint of worry in her eyes. "What's wrong?" I asked. She hesitated before replying. "You were right about James and Emily. When Reagan, the officer, and I went to collect your things, they were there together. They definitely weren't expecting us." I sighed, the reality of it all crashing down. "I'm sorry you had to witness that. What happened?" Rachel gave a small, sad smile. "They yelled at me to get out, but the officer quickly reminded them that they were violating a court order. I managed to grab your things, but," she trailed off, tears welling up as she recalled seeing the bloodstain on the carpet. "Please, Tom, don't ever do that again." "I promise," I said, raising my bandaged hands in a gesture of sincerity. The next morning, after getting cleaned up, Rachel met me as I was discharged, and we walked to her car. She drove us to a condo complex near Kings Park. Confused, I asked, "Rachel, why are we here? I thought I was staying at a hotel." She smiled softly. "You're staying with me. There's no need to waste money on a hotel when I have a perfectly good guest room. Reagan is meeting us here later this afternoon to go over your case." I had been to Rachel's place before, a cozy, two-story house where she lived with her daughter, Tilly. After getting settled in, Reagan arrived, her expression serious as she laid out the legal documents. "Tom, you're very fortunate," she began. She explained that James and Emily had nearly pulled off their scheme, but it was starting to unravel. My accounts had been frozen, including one they had fraudulently opened in my name. Reagan had even secured video evidence of them setting up the account, and she was pursuing charges for fraud and emotional distress. She assured me they wouldn't get away with this. Reagan also informed me that she had started legal proceedings against my former employer for wrongful termination. She was confident that everything would be resolved within the week and had scheduled a formal interview with Detective Wright for the next day. She emphasized the importance of following her instructions closely, as she expected James and Emily would soon be facing arrest. We spent the next hour going over the details and signing documents. Reagan reassured me that all charges against me would soon be dropped. After she left, I unpacked my belongings and sat with Rachel, talking about what might happen next. When Rachel left to pick up Tilly from school, I finally turned on my phone for the first time in days. There were several missed calls and texts, mostly from Emily, taunting me to sign the divorce papers before I ended up in jail. Surprisingly, there were also messages from my former employer, asking me to get in touch. But there was nothing from Sarah. When Rachel and Tilly returned, Tilly was full of energy, eager to share stories about her day. I found myself enjoying the time with her, helping her with homework and reading together. She was so much like Rachel, full of life and joy. It was a welcome distraction from the pain of Sarah's rejection. We had dinner together and watched some TV before bedtime. Tilly asked me to tuck her in, and when she gave me a hug goodnight, I nearly broke down in tears. Her genuine affection was such a stark contrast to the pain I'd been feeling. Afterward, Rachel and I sat on the couch, talking quietly. She held my hand, offering comfort and reassurance that everything would work out. The next day, after the interview with Detective Wright and Reagan, all charges against me were officially dropped. That evening, the news reported that arrest warrants had been issued for Emily and James for fraud and identity theft, but they were nowhere to be found. Later that night, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Sarah, reaching out for the first time, but I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to talk to her. The next day, she called and texted repeatedly, asking me to call her back, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Her sudden concern felt hollow, like it was only driven by the fallout from her mother and James's actions. I was angry that she had abandoned me so easily, and only now, when things were crumbling, did she decide to reach out. That night, I had a nightmare, a twisted version of the night I tried to end it all. In the dream, Emily and James were taunting me, laughing at my despair. Then Rachel, Sarah, and Mike joined in, all of them sneering and leaving me to die. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. Rachel rushed to my side with Tilly standing in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. I buried my head in my hands and sobbed. "I'm sorry. I just can't do this." Rachel and Tilly climbed onto the bed with me, and Tilly's small voice broke through my despair. "It's okay, Uncle Tom. You just had a bad dream. Mom and I will stay with you." I couldn't sleep after that, though Tilly eventually drifted off beside me, her tiny hand resting on my stomach. Rachel looked at me with deep concern. "Are you okay, Tom?" she asked softly, holding me close. I took a moment, then answered honestly, "No, I'm not. It was a nightmare about that night, about everything I couldn't finish, but Rachel understood." She kissed my cheek and nestled into me. "What are we going to do, Tom?" she whispered, her voice filled with pain. I hugged both her and Tilly tightly. "We'll figure it out. It's going to be okay," I assured her. In that moment, Rachel's concern and Tilly's innocent comfort made me feel more like myself than I had in weeks. I held them both until the sun began to rise, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in a long while. The next morning, after breakfast, Rachel took Tilly to school while I started looking for a counselor. I knew I needed help. By the time Rachel returned, I had already made several calls. She smiled at me when she saw what I'd been doing, but quickly grew serious. "Tom, can we talk?" she asked, leading me to the couch. I nodded, thinking I knew what was coming. "It's okay, Rachel," I said, trying to ease the tension. "I realized last night how scary it must have been with Tilly here. It's not good if I'm waking up screaming. I'll find somewhere else to stay. Her eyes widened, and she quickly grabbed my hands, looking panicked. No, Tom, that's not what I wanted to talk about. It's actually the opposite. She took a deep breath. Tom, I'm in love with you, she blurted out, almost babbling. Excuse me? I replied, stunned. I'm in love with you, and I have been for a long time, she repeated more softly, her face flushing. She searched my eyes, desperate for my reaction. When I heard you were in the hospital, I went out of my mind with worry. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you without telling you how I feel. I was speechless as she continued, her voice shaky but determined. I've tried to keep it to myself, but seeing you hurt last night, it broke my heart. Didn't you notice that I never go on dates? Yes, I admitted, confused, but I assumed it was because of Tilly. That's part of it, she acknowledged, but it's also because no one else compares to you. She explained how she had admired me from the moment she started working with me, how I treated her with respect, helped her through tough times, and made Tilly feel special. You've been like a father to her, Rachel said, her eyes misting over. When everything fell apart last week, you handled it with such grace. You didn't lash out, even when I did, she added, blushing at the memory of slapping me. You're an incredible man, Tom. I love you for so many reasons. If Emily was foolish enough to throw you away, I'm here to pick up the pieces. She leaned in and kissed me, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Will you have me, Tom? Will you let me be the one who loves you? Was stunned. I had fantasized about Rachel before, but this was happening so fast. I knew things with Emily were over, and Rachel's love made me feel less like a failure, but I also feared it might backfire. Rachel seemed to sense my hesitation, but said nothing. She simply took my hand and led me to her bedroom. Afterward, we lay together in silence, a quiet understanding passing between us. That night, I dreamed again of Emily and James tormenting me, but this time Rachel was there. She healed my wounds and carried me away from the pain. I woke to the sound of the alarm, shivering but not screaming. As we dressed, I told Rachel about the dream, and she looked concerned. She insisted I come with her to pick up Tilly from school, not wanting to leave me alone. A few more weeks passed, and news broke that both James and Emily had been arrested while attempting to flee the country. They had panicked after learning the charges against me had been dropped and tried to escape, driving from Perth to Adelaide, where they were caught at the border. It took 2 months to bring them back to Perth, but during that time, my relationship with Rachel grew stronger. I had moved into her bedroom, now our bedroom, and felt like I was in my 20s again. I realized I had fallen deeply in love with her. When James and Emily were finally brought back to Perth, I understood Rachel had been right all along. I barely thought about Emily anymore. A month later, Rachel, Reagan, and I testified in court against James and Emily. James avoided looking at me during the trial, and he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Emily, however, kept her eyes on me the entire time. The court revealed that James had masterminded the entire scheme, seducing Emily and orchestrating the fraud. Emily was sentenced to 20 years as an accomplice, with an additional 5 years for emotional cruelty, based on the evidence gathered from hidden cameras. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was finally free. After the verdict, the judge granted our divorce. Reagan pointed out that we had already agreed to split our savings and sell the house, with the proceeds to be divided immediately. After considerable persuasion from Reagan, I reluctantly agreed to act as trustee for Emily's funds while she served her sentence. Although I wasn't allowed to touch her money, I could invest it. The court ordered both Emily and James to begin their sentences immediately. Emily's lawyer requested that I spend an hour with her before she was taken to jail. After some hesitation, I agreed. In the sterile, cold atmosphere of the interrogation room, Emily looked utterly defeated, her shoulders slumped, her spirit broken. Unlike in the courtroom, she couldn't bring herself to meet my gaze. For a few minutes, we sat in silence, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between us. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Tom." I was taken aback that she spoke first, and even more so by her apology. "Are you really Emily?" I asked, allowing a hint of bitterness to seep into my tone. She looked up at me, her eyes glistening with tears. "Yes, Tom, I'm sorry," she repeated, her voice trembling. I wanted to dismiss her apology, to tell her it was too little, too late, but she continued before I could respond. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but please, just let me explain." I gestured for her to go on, though my heart was guarded. "Thank you," she said, her voice steadier now. "Believe it or not, I am sorry. I don't know when or how it all went wrong. I loved you, and deep down, I still do despite everything. But one day, I woke up feeling empty, like something was missing in my life. I can't explain it." She looked down at her hands, fiddling nervously with her wedding ring. "A few weeks after that feeling started, everything began to spiral out of control. I got angry at you because you still loved me, even though I didn't feel the same anymore. James noticed my frustration and started pushing my buttons. It took about a month before the affair began. He preyed on my insecurities and guilt, and once I was in too deep, he set his plan in motion." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "You may not have realized it, but James was always jealous of you, your success, your leadership. He convinced me to open a bank account in your name and make it look like you stole money. We both knew how much everyone trusted you. So by the time things started to unravel, he planned for us to escape with the money, believing we'd be out of reach. And all the while, you didn't care that you were destroying me," I said, struggling to keep my anger in check. She nodded, her face full of regret. "At first, I didn't want to do it, but James broke me down, piece by piece, until I was fully committed to the plan. To make it work, you had to be completely broken." "You almost succeeded," I replied, the bitterness in my voice unmistakable. "If not for Detective Wright and Rachel, you might have." We sat in silence for a moment, the enormity of everything that had happened settling over us. Then Emily asked softly, "Can I see them?" Understanding, I placed my scarred hands on the table. She gasped, her eyes widening as she saw the damage. She started to reach for them, but stopped herself, tears streaming down her face. Inside, I was torn by a whirlwind of emotions, rage, shame, and, to my surprise, a lingering shred of love for the woman I had once cherished. Emily seemed to sense my inner turmoil and looked at me intently. "I'm truly sorry, Tom. I'm ashamed of what I did, and I'm going to serve my 20 years without appeal because I deserve it," she said, her voice breaking. I nodded, relieved that she was finally taking responsibility. She looked up at me again and added, "Tom, just so you know, you were never a bad lover. You were far better than James. He was selfish and manipulative, unlike you. I have no excuse for how I treated you that last morning." We were quiet for a moment, the tension easing slightly. Then she asked, "You and Rachel?" "Yeah," I replied, feeling a mix of uncertainty and relief. She smiled weakly. "Good. She's loved you for years, you know. I just found out recently, I admitted." With a mix of passion and pain in her voice, Emily said, "May she love you and heal the pain I caused. She'll never betray you like I did. She's everything I'm not." "Emily," I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "Don't worry," she said, wiping my tears with her sleeve. "I agreed to your terms. I was surprised by how generous you were, even after everything." I sighed, the weight of it all pressing down on me. "Emily, I once loved you more than you'll ever know. If you had talked to me about your feelings, maybe we could have avoided all this. But now, I'm trying to move past what you did, though I still hold a lot of anger inside. I want to scream at you, to lash out for what you've done, but I can't. I chose to end my life, and I have to live with that choice." We sat quietly for a moment, the air thick with unresolved emotions. Then Emily spoke again, her voice filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Tom. You deserve so much better than what I gave you. I share the guilt for pushing you too far, and I'll always be ashamed of that. I saw the letter you wrote, and you were right. I'll burn for what I did. But I thank God you're still alive." I clenched my teeth, struggling with the surge of emotions inside me. How could she say these things now, after all that had happened? It wasn't fair. Needing to change the subject, I said, "I offered to manage your money out of respect for the years we shared. You'll have enough to start over when you get out if you want to." Emily noticed my attempt to shift the conversation, but went along with it, laughing bitterly. I'll be in my 60s by then, hopefully enough to retire on. Keep at it, and you'll make it to 80, I replied, trying to lighten the mood slightly. We talked briefly about our finances, which helped ease the tension, but I could tell there was still something weighing on her mind. Have you talked to Sarah? She asked hesitantly. I shook my head. No. Grace cut me off and believed your lies. It broke me that she never even asked for my side of the story. Emily looked down, tears in her eyes. She's young, Tom. She'll come around. Just give her time. If I was innocent, she just threw me away. I murmured, my voice heavy with sorrow. After that call, I turned away, trying to hide the tears that were threatening to spill over. If I had looked back, I would have seen Emily crying too, but I couldn't bring myself to face her. Instead, I pressed on, voice trembling. Rachel tried reaching out to Sarah while I was in the hospital, but she didn't get anywhere. I wiped my face and sat back down, while Emily did the same. She looked at me with a sorrowful expression, and after a moment, she said, Tom, I'm sorry. Her voice was strained, as if each word was a struggle. James and I planned all of this, including turning Sarah against you. Hearing her admit that, I felt a surge of anger that I barely contained. Emily lowered her head, knowing full well the devastation she had caused. If it makes any difference, Emily continued, her voice trembling, Sarah's cut me off too. She's angry, confused, and I don't know how to fix it. She feels guilty about how she treated you, and the fact that you're not talking to her is making it even worse. Emily paused, her hands trembling. Tom, I know I don't deserve anything from you, but please, try to forgive Sarah. She needs at least one parent in her life. Even if I weren't going to prison, the guilt of what I've done would haunt me forever. Please, Tom, take care of our daughter. I took a deep breath, struggling to keep my emotions in check. What you're asking isn't easy, Emily. You hurt me in ways I didn't think possible, but when Sarah said I was dead to her, that was the deepest cut of all. I want to reconnect with her, but the pain of what you both did, it's something I don't know how to get past. Emily nodded, her expression one of deep regret. I understand, she said softly, seeing the struggle I was going through. I sighed, trying to find the right words. Look, Emily, I'm trying not to hate you. I'm seeing a therapist, but it's hard not to want to scream at you, to lash out. As for Sarah, I'll think about talking to her, but I can't make any promises. Emily seemed to age visibly during our conversation. She slowly stood up, her body weighed down by the burden of her guilt. Tom, I know it doesn't mean much now, but I'm truly sorry for everything. There's no excuse for what I did, and I'll serve my time knowing that. I hope one day you might be able to forgive me. She looked up at me, her face etched with lines of pain. You may not believe this, but I still love you. I lost sight of that for a while, but it was always there. We stood in silence, the air thick with unsaid words. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she knocked on the door, signaling for her prison escort. Before leaving, she turned back one last time. Tom, love Rachel the way I should have loved you. Give her the life I foolishly threw away. Remember, there are people who care about you. Even when I was at my worst, I knew that much. You're becoming yourself again, and for that, I'm proud. Goodbye, Tom. I'll never forget you. As Emily walked out of the room, I stood there, reflecting on everything that had happened. There had been no anger, no shouting, just a quiet acceptance from Emily and a final farewell. As I left the room, I noticed a trail of tears on the floor where Emily had walked. I paused for a moment, mourning what had been lost, then turned and walked away. My spirits lifted slightly when I saw Rachel waiting for me in the public gallery, looking as beautiful as ever, even on such a solemn day. Did everything go okay? She asked gently. Yes, I replied, still processing the conversation. It was unexpected. I thought she'd make excuses, but she owned up to everything and showed genuine remorse. What do you think about that? Rachel asked, her eyes searching mine. I still feel a lot of anger toward James and her, I admitted, but unlike James, I also feel some sympathy for her. She knows she ruined everything, and now she's paying the price. Sarah's cut her off too. Rachel nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. Tom, Mike, and Sarah are here. They're at the cafe across the street. Mike told me they had a big argument over how Sarah treated you, and she's desperate to see you. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision. You think I should talk to her, don't you? Rachel nodded, her expression tender but firm. Yes, Tom. There's a wound in your heart that only Sarah can heal. But I'll be with you the whole time, and if I have to, I'll protect you like a lioness. I love you, Tom. I leaned in and kissed her, feeling a deep connection. I love you too, Rachel. It was the first time I'd publicly declared my love for her, and at that moment, I didn't care who saw. Rachel was all that mattered. Let's go, I said, and we walked hand in hand to the cafe. As we entered, we saw Sarah and Mike sitting at a table, both looking tense. Sarah seemed torn between fleeing and rushing into my arms. I opened my arms, and she immediately ran into them, clinging to me as she cried, I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. I glanced at Rachel, who gave me a reassuring smile, and then at Mike, who looked unsure of what to do. After a few moments, I gently pulled Sarah away, and we all sat down. I'll just talk to your mom, I said softly. Sarah nodded, her face flushed with emotion. I know, Dad. I'm used. I raised a hand to stop her. I know, Sarah. Your mom explained a lot, but what hurt the most was that you didn't even ask if I was innocent. It felt like you abandoned me when I needed you the most. Sarah's face reddened with shame. Dad, she began, but then she straightened up, determined. No, I need to say this. I should have given you a chance to explain, but I didn't. I can't just blame Mom or James. They convinced me that you were guilty, that you were going to prison, that you were cheating on Mom. She glanced at Rachel, then back at me. By the time you called, I was so angry and confused that I said things I regret. Mike added quietly, that's what caused most of our arguments, especially after Rachel left messages about you being in the hospital. I thought it was all a lie. Mom and James made it sound like you were just being dramatic, like Rachel was part of some scheme, Sarah said, her voice trembling as she glanced from Rachel to me. They said you were just trying to get attention, but it's true, Dad. You were really trying to— Her voice broke, unable to finish the thought. I nodded, taking a deep breath before showing Sarah the scars on my wrists. I'm sorry, Sarah. I was at my lowest point and didn't see any way out. I got drunk and made a terrible mistake, I said slowly. The words were heavy, but I needed her to understand the depth of what I'd gone through. Sarah began sobbing into her hands, and Rachel wrapped her arms around me, offering silent comfort as we all struggled with the weight of the moment. After a few moments of intense silence, Mike spoke up, trying to lighten the atmosphere. I know this is all really heavy, but can I assume something good came out of all this? He asked, gesturing toward Rachel and me. Sarah looked up, eyes wide with surprise. Dad, you and Rachel? She asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Yes, I nodded, feeling the need to clarify. But it wasn't an affair, despite what your mother told you. I never cheated on her. After I woke up in the hospital, Rachel refused to leave my side. Even she had believed what James and your mother were saying at first, but we talked it through and reconciled. That's when I realized how much she loved me. Rachel blushed, smiling shyly as she squeezed my hand. Mike grinned, and after a moment, Sarah's expression softened. Thank you, she said to Rachel, her voice filled with sincerity. Thank you for being there for my dad. Rachel chuckled, the sound easing the tension in the room. We spent the next few hours talking, sharing our stories and emotions. At one point, Sarah switched seats with Rachel and gave me a long, tearful hug. That day didn't resolve everything, but it was a step toward healing. Over the following months, Sarah and I worked hard to rebuild our relationship, going to counseling together to address the trust issues and emotional scars left by everything that had happened. One particularly tough counseling session involved me asking Sarah not to completely cut her mother out of her life. Despite everything, Emily was still her mother, and she was paying the price for her actions. Sarah reluctantly agreed to visit Emily, but only if I went with her the first time. The meeting was strained, and we didn't talk much about it afterward, but Sarah kept her word. A week later, Emily sent me a letter, thanking me for encouraging Sarah to visit. 6 months later, once life had settled down a bit, I proposed to Rachel during a quiet family dinner. Tilly and Sarah were thrilled, saying it was long overdue, and Mike shook my hand, repeating the same words I'd once said to him: "Take good care of her." Shortly after, Sarah and Mike got married with my blessing. Rachel visited Emily in prison and asked if she could step in as the mother of the bride. Emily, overwhelmed with emotion, agreed. Tilly served as the flower girl, proudly calling herself my second daughter. From that moment on, I was no longer Uncle Tom, but Dad. Walking Sarah down the aisle, I felt the last remnants of our strained relationship melt away. Later, Sarah sent wedding photos and a heartfelt letter to Emily, thanking her for allowing Rachel to fill such an important role. I heard that Emily keeps those mementos on the wall of her cell. Meanwhile, the legal issues surrounding James and Emily were finally resolved. Reagan negotiated a substantial settlement for Rachel and me. Clarence initially resisted, but just before the trial, he offered a deal that Reagan rejected as far too low. Eventually, we secured a high six-figure sum for Rachel and a seven-figure sum for me. Though the settlement was modest compared to the potential damage of a public trial, it forced Clarence to retire and sell his company for much less than it had been worth. With the settlement money, Rachel and I launched our own engineering consulting firm, offering both administrative and engineering services. Within 6 months, we had hired 5 employees and were working on major projects across the country. One of our first clients was Peter Pembroke, who took us out to dinner to apologize. He admitted that the project had nearly failed without my engineering expertise and was eager to make amends. Since then, we've been invited to all major Pembroke events, regardless of whether we're actively working on their projects. Peter was a good man who had been caught in a bad situation and wanted to do right by us. We sold Rachel's small house and bought a larger home with a breathtaking view of Kings Park. The old 5-bedroom, 3-bath house needed significant restoration, and we spent the next 2 years fixing it up, taking breaks only for family holidays, a wedding, and the birth of Sarah and Tilly's little brother, Byron. Life improved dramatically, though I still occasionally had nightmares. But Rachel was always there, helping me through them. More than a decade later, Byron was 10, and Tilly was in university, studying law like her Aunt Reagan. One lazy Saturday, Sarah and Mike were visiting us on our front terrace overlooking Kings Park. Byron was busy playing Xbox with my 7-year-old grandson, Bruce, while my 5-year-old granddaughter, Hope, tried to join in. Sarah brought up her mother cautiously. "Dad, I got a letter from Mom this week," she said, her tone careful. Although Emily wasn't a forbidden topic, everyone was still cautious when mentioning her. Over the years, I'd received several letters from Emily and had even visited her a few times. I knew she was undergoing treatment and had earned respect in prison, even though she still had 8 years left on her sentence. "What did she say?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Among other things, she mentioned that James was released last month," Sarah said, her voice tinged with unease. I silently sipped my drink, feeling Rachel's hand gently squeeze mine. "Did she say anything else?" Rachel asked, her voice steady. Sarah nodded. "Yeah, she said he came to see her. He didn't look well, and it wasn't exactly a peaceful conversation. I'm planning to visit her next week to find out more." We discussed it briefly, the past still lingering like a shadow, but knowing that as a family, we could face whatever challenges lay ahead together. After hearing the news from Sarah, I felt uneasy, so I decided to call David Wright, now a close friend and head of the major crimes team. "Tom, how are you? How's Rachel?" David greeted me warmly, his voice full of genuine concern. "Rachel's great," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "But I just found out James was released." David's tone shifted, becoming more serious. "Yes, I got the report yesterday. I plan to tell you when we met up for bowling next week. He's moved to Adelaide, got a job, and told his probation officer he wishes you'd rot in hell for ruining his life. He's had a rough go of it, though. I don't think it'll be a problem." "Thanks, David. That was my main concern. If I hear anything unusual, I'll let you know." We briefly talked about our upcoming bowling night and a barbecue we had planned before I returned to the table. Rachel's eyes met mine as I sat down. "You talked to David?" I nodded. He confirmed that James has moved to Adelaide. "He still hates me, but I'm not worried about it." Rachel took my hand. "The feeling's mutual, I'm sure." I shared the news with the rest of the family. The rest of the day was more subdued, but everyone made an effort to ensure I felt supported. That night, though, I woke up in a cold sweat, screaming from my first nightmare in years. In it, James had threatened my family, forcing me to relive that dark moment when I had nearly taken my life. I could still feel the cold steel of the razor in my hand. Rachel was awake instantly, pulling me close and whispering soothing words. She didn't hesitate to call my therapist, who graciously took our call at 2 a.m. I explained the dream, my voice shaky, while Rachel sat beside me, her tears silently falling as she listened. Talking about it helped, and my therapist suggested that the nightmare had been triggered by the news of James's release and my lingering anxiety. We scheduled a follow-up session to work through these feelings. After the call, Rachel checked on Byron, who was still sound asleep. Tilly had woken up but quickly went back to bed after overhearing our conversation. I lay back down, feeling emotionally drained, and Rachel snuggled in close beside me. "Do you think James will be a problem?" she asked softly, her concern evident in her voice. "No," I replied, trying to reassure her. "I think he'll disappear, and we won't hear from him again. And even if we do, we're prepared," I said, hinting at the hunting gear I had stored safely away, just in case. Rachel nodded, though the worry hadn't completely left her eyes. "I'm sorry this news upset you. Are you okay?" "Sort of," I admitted, sighing deeply. There will always be a shadow from those days, but I try to focus on the good now. "I'm grateful for you, Rachel. You saved my life." Rachel looked at me with a seriousness that made my heart swell. "I love you, Tom." "I love you too, Rachel," I replied, pulling her even closer. We fell asleep together, and while life wasn't perfect, it was full of more good days than bad. We still faced our share of fights, nightmares, and challenges, but I knew I had the unconditional love of a woman who had made everything possible, friends who accepted me for who I was, and a family that supported me through all of life's storms. In the years that followed, the memory of James faded, and though the scars remained, they were no longer raw. They had healed, a testament to the strength I had found in Rachel, in my children, and in myself. Life had its shadows, but it was also filled with light that we had fought for together.